My name is Ellie, and I am 22 years old. I live in a small, quiet apartment on the outskirts of town. It is close enough to the university to make commuting convenient, but far enough away to provide the peace and solitude I have always desired. My room is small, with a few old pieces of furniture, a small desk stacked with books, and a bed that I clear out every evening after class. It's not much, but it is mine. I came here 2 years ago, driven by hope and ambition, leaving behind my small hometown, where everyone knew each other and life felt like an endless loop. I was ready for a new experience. College was my chance to break free, discover who I truly was, and begin creating the life I desired. The transition was difficult. The city seemed unfamiliar and intimidating, and I didn't know anyone. The classes were challenging, and I often felt like I wasn't the most intelligent person in the room. I wanted to make a favorable impression, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't quite belong. Coming from a modest background, I sometimes wondered if that would always be a barrier in a world where connections and wealth appear to be so important. When I met Thomas, everything began to change. Thomas was 63 years old. He was at least as old as my father. He was the type of man who could command attention without saying a word. He possessed a rare ability to compel people to truly listen. He was a professor of literature whose lectures stood out from the rest. While other professors appeared to be going through the motions, Thomas made every word feel important. His lectures were not just about literature. They were about life, human nature, and the complexities of our world. Every class was a story. I never quite understood how he did it. His voice was deep, smooth, and full of emotion. Every lecture felt like a journey, and he had a magnetic presence. There was an unspoken quality about him that drew me in, and the more I observed him, the more his intellect and the way he carried himself, his wisdom, and the way his eyes sparkled when he spoke about the great works of literature captivated me. At first, my admiration for him was limited to the fact that he was a true giant in his field. I started staying after class, wanting to ask him questions, wanting to prove that I was dedicated, that I was serious. Though I was barely keeping up in my other classes, I was determined to do well in his. I wanted him to understand that I was serious and not just another student, and he inspired me to strive for improvement. "Ellie, you're a bright student," he told me one day, his voice warm, his smile genuine. "You've got more potential than you give yourself credit for." His words were like a balm to my self-doubt. They made me feel like I could do anything, like maybe I wasn't just another forgettable face in the lecture hall. Perhaps I had something valuable to contribute. But when the midterms arrived, I discovered that I had procrastinated, leaving everything until the final minute. I hadn't done the necessary reading. I hadn't put in the effort. My paper wasn't my best work, far from it, but still, I couldn't help but think that Thomas might see something in me, something beyond my laziness, something worth rewarding. I harbored an unrealistic expectation that he would grant me an exception upon receiving the grades. However, I was taken aback by the flawless grade awarded to a paper that was entirely unworthy. I knew I hadn't earned it, but I also knew that somehow, in some way, I had. It was as if he had seen past the mistakes and seen me for what I could be, instead of what I had been. I couldn't contain the feeling that washed over me. Gratitude, confusion, and something else that I couldn't name felt like I owed him something, like he had done me a favor, and I couldn't leave. I knew I needed to thank him, so the next day I went to his office and knocked softly on the door, not knowing what to expect. When he looked up from his papers, I felt a flutter in my heart. "Thank you, Professor," I said, my voice shaking. Thank you for the grade. I did not deserve it, but I sincerely appreciate it. He smiled the same warm, kind smile that made me feel like I was the only one in the room. You deserve it, Ellie, he said, his eyes meeting mine. I see something in you. You only need to believe in yourself. These words, as simple as they were, stayed with me. He believed in me, and I finally believed in myself after a long time. It wasn't just the grade. It was the fact that someone like him saw something in me that made me believe I was capable of becoming more than I had previously imagined. I thought maybe there was more to this than grades. Maybe I can get more from him. He'd been kind to me. He had. He praised me, and I couldn't stop thinking about how much I liked him. I didn't want to admit it, but I had become obsessed. A few weeks later, I found myself staying after class once more. But this time, my focus wasn't on the assignments or my grades. Instead, it was on something else that sparked my excitement. I was struggling, financially, and I had no idea how I was going to get through the semester. I needed a way to secure my future. I needed help. Professor, I need your help. My voice trembled, but I tried to sound confident. I'm doing poorly in some of my other courses. If I want to continue my education, I must first improve my grades. He looked at me with an unreadable expression, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. What are you asking, Ellie? Asked, his voice calm but with an undertone that I couldn't quite place. My heart raced in my chest. I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a whisper. I'll do whatever you want to make sure I pass. There was a long, heavy silence between us. I could feel the tension rising, and I regretted my words as soon as they left my lips. What did I ask for? Was I really ready to go this far? Finally, he approached me, his expression softening slightly, but his eyes remaining sharply focused. Do you understand the consequences of this? He inquired. His voice was low and serious, and despite my uncertainty, I nodded. If I understood, I didn't mind. I needed it. That night, I needed him, and our relationship crossed a boundary. It was not love at first. Yes, it was transactional. I gave him what he wanted, and he provided me what I needed. At first, it felt like a relief, a way to secure my future, a way to ensure that I didn't have to worry about my grades anymore. But when it was over, there was a rush of satisfaction followed by a profound sense of guilt. It wasn't supposed to feel this way. It was supposed to be simple, just a way to keep me in school. But somewhere along the way, it evolved into something more. The more I saw him, the more I desired him physically. My connection was unmistakable, but there was something deeper. It wasn't only about grades anymore. It was about him. It was also about us. I tried to convince myself that I was only using him as a means to an end, but I couldn't do it. I was falling. I couldn't stop myself from falling for him. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was dangerous, but I couldn't stop myself. Every time I was with him, I felt drawn deeper into his orbit. Everything changed after that first night, including the dynamic between Thomas and me. At first, I tried to convince myself that it was simply about getting ahead and securing my future. I told myself I was not in love with him. How could I be? He was my professor. He was old enough to be my father. It didn't make sense, but the more I saw him, the more I realized that my feelings weren't just about grades or getting the validation I craved. They were about him, about how he made me feel, how he saw me. I couldn't stop thinking about him. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those gray eyes that seemed to pierce through me, and the parts of myself that I kept hidden from the outside. I had moments with him. When he gazed at me with a certain softness, I wondered if he felt the same way, or if he was falling for me too. However, in the back of my mind, I knew that this was wrong. It was dangerous. It could destroy us both. But still, I couldn't pull away. The connection was too strong. We began to meet in secret, often late at night, when the university was quiet and the halls empty. Our meetings were a mix of lectures, personal discussions, and fleeting. Each time it felt like I was falling deeper into something I couldn't control. Thomas would speak to me about his past, about the life he had lived before becoming a professor. His regrets, his eye listened to him, mesmerized by the depth of his knowledge, his wisdom, and his vulnerability. It felt intimate in a way I couldn't explain. It wasn't just the physical connection, it was the emotional bond that was growing between us, a bond that I couldn't break no matter how much I tried. The affair, though it had started as a means to secure my academic future, had now evolved into something far more complicated. Thomas was no longer just my professor. He was someone I had come to rely on, someone I had begun to fall for, and I knew deep down that I wasn't the only. There were moments when he would look at me with a tenderness that made my heart ache. In those moments, I allowed myself to believe that he cared for me, that I was more than just a student to him, but the guilt and shame began to grow. I knew what we were doing was wrong, that we were both breaking so many unspoken rules. I had crossed a line, and every time we met, I felt the weight of it on my shoulders. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about the lies I had to tell myself, the lies I had to tell that no one knew what was really going on between us, and I had to keep it that way. The secrecy felt suffocating, but at the same time, it was the only thing that made the affair possible. I kept telling myself it would stay simple, just about grades and my future. But every time I saw Thomas, I felt like our boundaries were blurring. I was no longer doing this for my grades. I was doing it for him. I was doing it because I wanted him, and I couldn't deny it no matter how hard I tried. After falling for him, I knew it was dangerous, but it was too late. Then, several weeks later, I received an unexpected invitation. Thomas invited me to meet him in his office after hours. I didn't think much of it at first. It wasn't uncommon for him to invite students to meet with him one-on-one to discuss assignments or concerns. But as the time approached, I felt a knot form in my stomach. There was something in the air that felt unusual. I was unsure if I was ready. When I arrived at his office, the door was slightly ajar, foreshadowing what was to come. I softly knocked and entered. Thomas sat at his desk, glasses perched on his nose and papers scattered across the surface. He didn't look up at first, and I felt like an intruder. I hesitated, unsure of what to say about his personal space in his life. But then he looked up, and the moment our eyes met, I felt a rush of emotions rush through me. The warmth that had once been in his gaze had faded, replaced by something I couldn't quite place. "Ellie," he explained. Softly gesturing to the chair across from him, I sat down, trying to catch my breath. Something about the way he spoke made my heart race. It wasn't the usual warmth I'd come to expect from him. There was a sharpness to his voice, a quiet tension in the air that made everything seem heavier. "I wanted to discuss our direction with you." With a steady yet profound voice, he said, "What we're doing, Ellie, can't go on." My heart skipped a beat, and his words struck me like a slap in the face. It felt like someone tore away the ground beneath me, leaving me adrift in a sea of confusion and uncertainty. "I've been thinking about this a lot," he continued, his gaze now fixed on me, as if attempting to read my every thought. "This situation is neither fair to you nor to me. I can't continue any longer." His words crushed me. I wanted to argue too, Tell him I didn't care about fairness, that all I cared about was him and what we had. But the reality of the situation hit me hard. This was incorrect. We were both aware of this, but it did not diminish our feelings. I tried to speak, but the words stayed in my throat. I felt as if the silence between us was drowning me. But no, Professor, I don't want it to end. I finally said, my voice trembling, I need you. I have fallen in love with you. The words came out without a care. They had been building up inside me for weeks, and now they were out. Thomas just stared at me, his expression unreadable, before slowly shaking his head. Ellie, he said, his voice firm but sad, you are not in love with me. You are in love with the idea of me. I'm your professor, and this was always a mistake. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him. I didn't mind the age difference or the complications. All I cared about was him, but deep down, I knew he was correct. This wasn't love. It couldn't be. We were two individuals ensnared in a predicament beyond our control. Two individuals who had transgressed a boundary they should have never crossed. This has to end, Ellie, he said, his voice filled with regret. I apologize, but it is over. I stood there, frozen. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as I realized the man I had trusted and fallen for was walking away. I had given him everything, my trust, love, and body, and now he was leaving me behind. The days that followed were hazy. I continued to class, doing my best to act normal despite the fact that everything felt off. The warmth in Thomas's eyes had vanished, replaced by something distant, cold. I tried to avoid him, but it seemed impossible. Whenever I saw him, my heart tightened. I couldn't look at him without feeling an intense, painful longing. One day after class, he approached me in the hallway. He had a worn and drawn face, and for a moment he remained silent, staring at me with his stormy eyes, seemingly struggling to articulate his thoughts. Finally, he spoke, his voice full of emotion. I want you to know that he said I never meant to hurt you, but I'm not who you think I am. I can't be who you want me to be. I stood there, his words sinking into my chest. Part of me wanted to scream and tell him that I didn't care about anything. I wanted to be with him, but I knew better. He said softly, "This couldn't be goodbye, Ellie." Before turning and walking away, I watched him disappear down the hallway, my feet rooted in place. The air felt heavy, weighed down by the finality of the situation. I knew this meant the end of the affair, the feelings, and the illusion. It was over.